I'm Professor Rod Evans, and today I'm going to be going over the syllabus for Business Ethics, Philosophy 303 for Old Dominion University. Now, what's going on is this for the summer, and this material may be used for beyond the summer of 2020, but for 2020, it's accurate to say that this course is going to function as an asynchronous online course. Now, I need to be very specific about what that means for this particular course. So what's going to happen is you're going to be getting a number of lectures, and they're going to be delivered to you through links to your email, and they're going to be connected to YouTube. So they're going to be posted on YouTube, and that's what's going to happen. And you're going to end up getting them even beyond where you would be on the syllabus if we were meeting in person. So I want you to know that you're going to actually be able to get ahead of where the syllabus is, though I'm going to try to give you the tests during the scheduled times on the syllabus. So another way of saying this is, although the material for this course is delivered online without scheduled meetings, there are exceptions to that, and the exceptions are going to be for the two exams for this course. Now, I need to talk a little bit about the exams. Let's just say for right now that the two exams will be given to you through your email. They are going to be open book, though they'll be timed and scheduled. In other words, you'll see when they're due for the on the syllabus. And so what will happen is the tests again are going to be open book, open notes. You'll end up typing your answers, and you'll save the document, and then you'll be sending it back to me and as an email to revans@odu.edu. We're going to talk more about that later, but again, you're not going to be proctored during the exams. They are open books, open notes, but you will be timed. The exams will be scheduled. If you cannot, if the schedule won't work for you for one of the exams, you need to let me know in advance, and it's possible that I could deliver the exam to you at least 12 or 24 hours before or after the original schedule. But most of you, if not all of you, will be taking the exams, the two exams, at the originally scheduled time. Okay, now we'll talk more about that later. Okay, so what I want to do today is to go over the syllabus, and I'm specifically interested in right now for the summer 2020 syllabus. Now, as I've said before, this class is going to be, the material will be asynchronously delivered, the lectures will be. And that means that you don't have to, as you would with an ordinary like WebEx course, you don't have to tune in at a particular time for a live lecture. The lectures, you're going to have links to the lectures which will be on YouTube, and what will happen is you'll have access to at least 1 or 2 weeks ahead of schedule when it comes to the lectures, so you can actually get ahead of the syllabus. But I'll try to have the exams pretty much scheduled for the original schedule, and I'll try to stick with that. Okay, so again, this is Business Ethics. It's an asynchronous online course except for the two exams, and the book that you'll be using, the book is Business Ethics, William H. Shaw, okay, 8th edition. This happens to be Instructor's edition. 8th edition, William H. Shaw, Business Ethics, okay? And the student ISBN is 978 133 943 075, and I can of course I can write that down for you. Okay, 978 133 943 075. Okay, so that is going to be the student ISBN for the text. Now, Now, one of the great things about having the course delivered as it is, you can freeze whatever you want. You can pause it. You can play it back, and that's really good. In fact, what I suggest is that every 25 minutes or so, I suggest that you should pause the lecture, okay, and then within a few minutes go back to it so that you have a break. You walk around, you sip on some water, because given the limitations of people's attention spans, what happens is people find it increasingly difficult to pay attention after 20 or 25 minutes. So I really do suggest that people take frequent but short breaks every 25 minutes or so as they listen to these lectures. But in any event, let me go over the syllabus. And this is, again, for summer 2020. Okay, so again, I'm Professor Rod Evans. This is, of course, Business Ethics. I've mentioned the book we'll be using. There's just one book. You can get it, suppose you can get it through ODU. Actually, you can get it online pretty easily. You can get it used, and it's not going to be normally very expensive if you get it used. And now the other thing I want to draw your attention to is that, again, the teaching method is going to be lecture. We're going to have tests. We're going to have various. Well, let's put it this way. We're going to have we'll have lectures. You'll be able to ask questions through email. If you want, you can actually schedule some phone chats with me. That's quite easy to do. We can do that. But you normally won't be asking questions during the lecture because, again, these are pre-recorded. Okay, so I want you to understand that. Also, and you'll see this when you see the syllabus, the grading scale is conventional. A is 93 to 100, A minus 90 to 92, B plus is 87 to 89, B 83 to 86, and so on. Now, you're going to have 4 sources of your grade. You're going to have the first test, and I'm going to talk more about that in a little bit, but that's going to be the first test has things like multiple choice and true false. You're going to you'll get a review sheet for both of the tests, okay? So I want you, we'll talk more about that and about any essays you'll be getting for the first test. There will not be any essays, though, on the final exam. But we have thorough reviews for each of the 2 tests. Okay, so 1/4 of your grade will be determined by your score in the first test. There's also what I call a case paper. Now, at the end of each chapter, you have some cases. The first case is called, has a name, but it's 1.1, that meaning that it's in the first chapter and it's the first case. The second case in the first chapter is 1.2. Now, within a few days after the class begins, I'll assign everyone a case. Okay. Now, what are you supposed to do with these cases? Okay, the cases are in the book. What are you supposed to do with them? Well, very simply, you're supposed to discuss the factual background of each case. You're supposed to tell me the persons involved in each case. You're supposed to outline the ethical issues of each case, and every case has ethical issues. You're supposed to explain if the ethical issues were resolved, how they were resolved. Also, you're supposed to, if they weren't resolved, the ethical issues, you're supposed to explain or at least suggest how they might have been resolved. Some of the cases even have legal issues, and what you should do there is explain the legal issues, and typically those legal issues were resolved, and then explain how they were resolved. So the case paper, which will be about 1,000 words, will require really argumentative writing. It's really an explanatory writing. It's kind of in a narrative, and again, it should be pretty straightforward. Now, if you don't get an assigned case, if I don't tell you what your case is within 5 days after the first class, please email me and let me know, and I'll send that to you. Now, sometimes people actually enter the class late and register late, and so if I send out the cases according to an early roll through Blackboard, I mean, give you, send them out through email. Some people won't get it because because they've signed up for the class late. So if you don't get your case assignment within 5 days after the class begins, you really need to email me and ask for your case. Okay. Now there's also a final paper. Now, by the way, the format for the case, as far as the style of format, don't worry about it. If you want, all you have to do is use the material from the book. If you want to do outside research through internet, that's fine, but it's not required. Now, as to the final paper, the final paper will be argumentative. It'll be at least 2,000 words long. One thing I want to mention to you is that all the documents for the course are on Blackboard under syllabus. And there's a document there that actually is called Creating an Argumentative Paper, or how to write an argumentative paper, basically. And I want you to read that because it tells you, you don't have to follow it uncritically, but it gives you a kind of rough outline of how to write an argumentative paper, and that you'll have a thesis statement within the first paragraph. You'll have maybe 3 to 5 reasons in favor of your thesis. For each reason you have in favor, try to find at least one objection, and then explain why, although the objection may have some merit, its strength isn't sufficient to overturn your thesis. And then you have like a summarizing and concluding paragraph. But in any event, I do suggest that you look very thoroughly at the documents that are posted on Blackboard, and all of them are posted under syllabus. Again, includes how to write an argumentative paper. Now, as to the format, I don't care whether it's APA, whether it's Chicago Manual Style. We're talking about the final paper. It doesn't really matter to me. But if you do have any citations at all, if you use any source at all, even the book, that should be cited either within the body of the final paper or within endnotes. Okay, so again, you've got a 2,000 word case paper. It should be typed and double spaced. The topic can be, but need not be, based on a case study. Now, if the topic concerns something that's not even remotely connected to any subject in our book, then you really ought to ask me whether it's an appropriate topic for your term paper. Okay, and if it is based on a case, and remember, it has to be an argumentative paper, but if it is based on a case, it cannot be the same case you were assigned for your case paper. All of this, by the way, everything I'm saying really, or just about everything, is covered on the syllabus, and you should be reading that very thoroughly and looking at it very thoroughly once the class begins. Okay, so, and the other thing is you're going to have a final exam, which will be true, false, multiple choice, and matching. The final exam will be largely cumulative, but it'll cover more material from the first half of the book than the second half. Luckily for you, my students, there is a review sheet, and there's a review sheet for the first exam and a review sheet for the final, and of course I'm going to have gone over the material for both of those exams, both those review sheets, before you take those exams. Okay, now we have also a tentative schedule, which is on your syllabus. Now, if you have any questions about any of this, I suggest that you email me. If you want to talk over the phone, we can arrange for a phone appointment of whatever length you want. If you think it'll be roughly 10 or 15 minutes, that's cool. If you think it's longer, that's fine too. But we can easily arrange for that. I want to be very available to you guys. But it's very important for you to understand that because this is an online course, you need to be very proactive. You need to study very regularly for this course if you're going to do well. Okay, you've got to be very, very proactive. Now, the other thing I want to talk about is I want to talk about the subject of ethics in general. Okay, so let's talk about this. In short, ethics deals with moral character and the moral rules that govern and limit our conduct. And it, as our book notes, it investigates questions of right and wrong, fairness and unfairness, good and bad, duty and obligation, and justice and injustice. Now, the subject of business ethics studies what constitutes right or wrong or good or bad conduct in a business context. Now, so what would be an example? Let's give an example that our author Shaw gives. Would it be right for a store manager to break a promise to a customer and sell some hard-to-find merchandise to someone else whose need is greater? Here's another question. What, if anything, should a moral employee do when his or her supervisor refuses to look into apparent wrongdoing in a branch office? I'm going to talk more about that later in the course when we talk about whistleblowing. By the way, as the term is used in this course, the term business can denote a corner hot dog stand or something as large as a multinational corporation in several countries. A business person may be a gardener in business for herself, or a company president responsible for thousands of workers and millions of shareholder dollars. Now, people will sometimes say, cynically, that there can be no ethics in business, or that the expression business ethics is self-contradictory. They say it's an oxymoron. Now, we shall find out in this course that all of us have an interest in holding businesses morally accountable, and fraud, for example, is properly illegal. I want to talk about the distinctions between moral and non-moral standards, and this is covered in the first chapter of our book. And today I'm going to be covering actually most, if not all, the first chapter, and the next lecture will be the second chapter of our text. Now, as the book notes, whether your new sports car can top out at 120 or 130 miles per hour is a non-moral question. But whether you should decide to top it out on Main Street on Wednesday at high noon is a moral question. Now, why is the latter a moral question but not the former? Well, intentional reckless driving is morally charged because such driving poses a serious risk to others who could suffer extreme injury or even death. Now, not all standards are moral standards. They're grammatical standards. In English, we say, please avoid double negatives, especially in formal speech, right? There are artistic standards. It's poor technique to photograph the finish of a horse race with low-speed film. There are fashion standards. Wearing a bikini to a formal dinner or dressing loudly and ostentatiously at a serious business meeting violates fashion standards. But we can contrast those non-moral standards with moral standards, which typically concern behavior that can be of serious consequence to human welfare. By lying, stealing, or killing people, harm others. So we can say the following. Typically, moral standards will concern behavior that can seriously affect people's welfare. More so than like standards of etiquette. Whether someone eats forks with say, one utensil around another, a spoon rather than a fork. There's my cat, by the way, in the background. Okay, another thing about moral standards is that moral standards typically take priority over other standards. For example, you can't morally justify not jumping into a swimming pool to save a drowning person because it's bad taste to be wearing sopping wet dress clothes. And third, the soundness of moral standards will depend on the adequacy of the reasons that support or justify them. Now, that's a complex question about how are moral standards justified. Let me just say for our purposes right now that moral standards typically are supposed to have justification, and that the justification is going to be complex, but we can say that typically it will relate to values connected to the importance of our gaining social cooperation from others, reducing or preventing social conflict and suffering. And so if you can tie moral standards to something related to those goals, or to something that is by the way, the golden rule, treat people the way you want to be treated, would be a good example of something that seems well connected to the prevention of suffering and to preventing social or reducing social conflict. Now, we can contrast moral standards with fashion standards, which are set by clothing designers, merchandisers, and consumers. Grammatical standards are set by well-educated language users. Legal standards are set by legislators in the courts. But moral standards, in contrast, are not made by specially authorized people. Moral standards will depend on the reasons supporting them. And again, precisely what constitutes adequate reasons for moral standards can be controversial and involve different philosophical theories. Moral standards, though, I can say this with some degree of certainty, are not equivalent to legal standards. Although many, if not most, actions considered seriously immoral in our society will be illegal, the legality of an action will not guarantee that the action was morally right any more than the illegality of an action will entail that it's morally wrong. What are examples of law that aren't equal or are not well, do not well define morality? Well, how about this? We know that lying is legal, typically, most of it, but it's wrong, right? So most lies are legal, but they're wrong. Similarly with promise breaking, right? A lot of people, some people make a promise with a view to breaking it, and normally that's wrong, but it doesn't mean it's illegal. Okay, so we know that a number of activities can be quite legal, yet they're morally wrong. Racial segregation and other unfair practices have been legal in the United States, and they were in some other countries, as when South Africa was ruled by a white minority. Failing to shout "watch out" to a blind man about to fall into a manhole, one could argue is morally wrong, but it has been legal in the United States. Many of the atrocities, of course, the Nazis committed against minorities were legal in Nazi Germany. Now, I want to talk a bit about professional codes. Lying somewhere between etiquette and law are professional codes of ethics. And these are rules that are supposed to govern the conduct of members of a given profession. Just by practicing the profession, members of it are understood to have agreed to its professional code. By violating a professional code, violators can be subject to disapproval, formal reprimand, or revocation of their licenses, as when some lawyers have been disbarred from practicing law. Not all rules of a professional code are purely moral, as when some professionals may, out of professional courtesy, not charge other members of the profession for certain services. Other rules are designed to benefit the group's financial interests, as when some groups prohibit price competition. Note further that professional codes may not cover all the ethical issues with which professionals may have to deal. And what's more, it's at least possible that professional standards or customary practice may conflict with ordinary demands of morality. Certain business practices may justify whistleblowing, which can require people to act against loyalty to an employer. Now, people ask, well, where do moral standards come from? Well, people come to accept certain standards and to form moral convictions through many different sources, as from their parents, peers, teachers, religious leaders, and their experiences generally. Philosophers are usually more concerned with how standards can or cannot be justified than how people have acquired those beliefs concerning the standards. We shall soon examine some of the moral ethical theories. Now, how about religion and morality? Many people learn about morality through religion. Any religion provides its believers with a worldview, part of which usually includes moral instruction. Undoubtedly, many people learn about morality within the context of religious instruction. For example, in Buddhism, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, and other religions, people are exhorted to care about others. Our author Shaw asserts that morality, however, need not rest on religion. Many believers, however, of course, will disagree. Many religious believers assert that without religion, people would have no motive or incentive to treat others well. And further, many, but not all religious believers assert that only religion can provide people with proper guidance. Still further, many religious believers argue that morality, if valid, must be based on God's commands, which they say don't simply reveal what is right, but which in fact make actions right. Now, each of those three claims has been criticized. Again, look at the claim that religion provides the only effective incentive for moral behavior. The desire to reach heaven and avoid hell motivates many people. Yet there are other motives or incentives that are common. For example, many people act morally because of their habits and training. They are the sorts of people for whom moral considerations weigh heavily. To such people, it rarely, if ever, occurs to them to hurt or mistreat others. And even if such people see opportunities for mistreating others, such mistreatment would contradict their values and self-images. Further, many people are motivated to do what is right because they care for others or just because it's right. Still further, many people do what is right to gain approval, as from their parents, peers, or colleagues, or to avoid earthly punishment. Let's look at the second claim. Many people argue that only religion can provide effective moral guidance. While religious instruction can certainly inspire people, sensitize people's sense of morality, and provide them with guidance, even religious people need to engage in some moral thinking and reasoning and use their own finite understanding. For example, some of the Bible's most important commandments need interpretation. The Bible says, "Thou shalt not kill," that is murder. Yet sensitive and intelligent Christians and others at times disagree over the morality of war, capital punishment, abortion, and euthanasia. Furthermore, the most obvious cases of murder, such as killing for hire or killing for the thrill of it, can be seen to be wrong without any religious instruction. Let's talk about, this is kind of a bizarre topic, but let's talk about somebody killing for the fun of it. I'm assuming that all of us believe that's morally wrong. Well, here's the question. Do we think that it's wrong if we are believers because of the Creator making it wrong? Or do we think that there's something intrinsically or inherently wrong about killing for the fun of it? Let's suppose God commanded, or let's change this. Suppose God condemned an action on Monday but required it on Tuesday without any explanation. Would the action be wrong on one day and right the next? Or if right and wrong can be determined by commands only, regardless of the nature of what is commanded, what does that view do to the belief that morality is objective and necessarily tied to fairness, justice, benevolence, and other moral concepts? Okay, now these are just some things to think about. I mean, I don't want to go too deeply into this except to say that even many people believe in God believe that morality should help us get along with one another, help us reduce or prevent social conflict, should help us reduce and prevent suffering. Okay, and we all have an interest in that, whether we're religious or not, and that's those are some of the points made by our author Shaw. Now, another topic I want to talk about is the idea of cultural relativism, which actually historically has been more popular among social scientists, and especially anthropologists, than among philosophers. But what is cultural relativism? Well, it's a theory, and it asserts that standards of morality, standards of normality, standards of rationality or reasonableness, and standards of beauty are created by, dependent on, and relative to each culture. So in other words, what it's saying is that when you talk about these ultimate standards for various sorts of values, whether it's morality, normality, rationality, or beauty, that those standards are in a sense constructed from the beliefs, attitudes, and customary practices of each culture, and that each culture is the final arbiter of what is right, for example, and what is wrong within it. Okay, now interestingly, cultural relativism seems to treat moral norms as kind of like the rules of a game, like a board game. And so, for example, I used to play a lot of Monopoly, even in grad school, by the way. And Monopoly, the game Monopoly, has rules, of course. And those rules will tell you the appropriate moves in Monopoly. But we don't say of those rules, we don't say, are these rules right or wrong? Are they true or false? We don't say that. We just say, well, those are the rules, and those are the conventions that define what can be done in that game, you see. Well, in a way, that's Monopoly, for example. It's chess. Chess has its rules too. Okay, so, and yet the cultural relativists seem to regard moral norms in that fashion, and so, we'd say, well, moral norms. You just have to look at what are the prevailing ideas and the prevailing attitudes and customs of a particular culture, and it's not a matter of the moral norms being correct or incorrect, wise or unwise. Those are just the conventions that people have adopted. Now, sometimes people use the term ethical relativist to refer to cultural relativism. The way I do it is I say cultural relativism is a large term, the genus, and within it you have various species. So cultural relativism includes a form of ethical relativism, normality relativism, rationality relativism, and beauty relativism. Okay, so all cultural relativists are also ethical relativists. Okay, and a person's an ethical relativist if the person believes that the standards of right and wrong are relative to groups or individuals. Okay, so here's the thing. A cultural relativist believes that right and wrong are relative to some very complex groupings called cultures. Okay, so again, cultural relativists are also ethical relativists. Now, so as I've said before, the ethical relativist, okay, let's take the ethical relativist who's also a cultural relativist, right? Insists that what makes practices right or wrong will be cultural approval and disapproval alone, and that cultures, in a sense, can't be mistaken about the moral nature and their moral evaluation of practices within that culture. So this has a lot of interesting implications, and I'll get into that in a moment. And so what our author Shaw says about cultural relativism, and again, we're talking about its ethical component. Well, he says that ethical relativism has some unsatisfactory implications, and I want you to know these standard criticisms. First, ethical relativism, he says, undermines any moral criticism of the practices of other societies as long as their actions conform to their own standards. We cannot say that slavery in a slave-holding society like that of the American South 150 years ago was immoral and unjust as long as that society held it to be morally permissible. And that also, suppose somebody is part of some sort of African society during, let's say, Hitler's reign and Hitler's systematic genocide of millions of people. Are we going to say that people in those societies, those African societies, would be just purely ethnocentric if they have condemned Hitler for killing millions of peaceful people who belong to various minorities? Now, also, the fact that for the relativists, there's a criticism that according to the relativists, there's no such thing as moral progress. Now, I realize that can be a controversial idea. But let me just try to put some context here. Although moralities certainly, or moral codes, can change, according to the thoroughgoing ethical relativists, they cannot be objectively better or worse. In short, ethical relativism denies that it's legitimate to say that a society or a culture that respects all people, not just the majority, or not just members of a particular tribe, is objectively morally superior to a society that respects only the majority or only members of a certain tribe. Third, ethical relativism implies that moral reformers who attack once widely accepted practices such as slavery and denying women economic and political rights are encouraging people to do what is immoral. Let me talk a little bit more about this idea of moral progress. Again, I realize this can be a controversial concept. Years and years ago, it was the norm for there to be purely tribal moralities. In other words, you would have tribes thousands of years ago, and they would condemn the selling of spoiled meat to members of the tribe, but they would say it's perfectly permissible to sell spoiled meat to those outside the tribe. Okay, And then more and more people came along, including various people who were called prophets, including Jesus and others, who said everyone is your neighbor, everyone matters, not just someone who speaks the same language, who's a member of your tribe, but that everyone is worthy of the golden rule. Treat people the way you want to be treated. Now, note that it makes sense for an ethical relativist to caution us against assuming that, say, the American way of doing things is the only correct way and that everybody should be exactly the way most Americans are. Okay, so we have to understand that there can be a great deal of variety within ethical codes, and that doesn't mean that one person's right and another's wrong, provided that there are some core values of respecting people. And of course, presumably the Nazis went against those core values. But I mean, we can acknowledge, let's say, that Amish society is in certain respects different from our general American society, without saying that Amish society is bad, or that one of them is right and the other is wrong. Okay, so you can have a great deal of variety in moral codes, provided that you have certain basic norms that respect individuals. Okay, and so one thing that the cultural relativist does is to get us to understand that there are various ways of organizing society, there are various ways of living, and we shouldn't think that there's just one set of very highly specific norms that'll fit everybody. And that makes sense. That makes sense. So there are parts of cultural relativism that make sense. And we also need to understand that you can have various rules differing from one society to another because of different environments and different technical and other resources. For example, if there is habitual water scarcity in one society, presumably there'll be various rules against the luxurious use of water, as when people want to wash their cars. But in a society where water is plentiful, someone could say you could use as much water as you're willing to pay for. And yet those societies could have very similar, if not the same, ultimate principles, such as trying to maximize the general welfare. So you need to understand that a lot of moral diversity can result from people having different environments and different resources. But in any event, we need to, we need, in other words, to understand that the cultural relativist has some important things to tell us about the danger of ethnocentrism, the belief that one's own culture or one's own group is inherently superior to all others and everybody should emulate that culture or that group. The ethical relativist tells us again that if a culture approves of some practice, it must be right because and only because it's approved. And that, according to the critics of cultural relativism, is a very, very serious mistake. I mean, the idea that cultural approval alone can make a practice right or wrong. I mean, if there's genocide and somebody's trying to kill all Jewish people, all gypsies, or gay people, and you go on and on, just whole groups of people. There are people trying to kill, and they say, well, we can institutionalize it, we can make it legal to do it, we can get the most people to go along with it within a given culture. Do we want to say that if that were the case, that would make those practices morally right? An ethical relativist, again, of the cultural variety, cultural relativist variety, asserts that what makes a practice right or wrong in a society is cultural approval or disapproval. The position of ethical relativism, again, within cultural relativism, implies that some practice, say slavery, can be right in one culture and wrong in another at the same time. Not just considered right in one culture and considered wrong in another culture, but actually be right in one culture and be wrong in another. Some differences in cultural moral codes arise, as I said before, from factual differences. And as I said before, a society where water is scarce will presumably have more rules governing its use than a society where water is plentiful. Now, I want to talk now about a kind of variety of a kind of relativism when it comes to ethics. And this is, you might call this business ethics relativism. And there was a famous essay published by a guy named Albert Carr, that's C-A-R-R-R. And the essay is called "Is Business Bluffing Ethical?" And I want you to understand this essay and its criticism, the criticism of the essay as by our author. Now, according to Albert Carr, business is like a game, like poker, he says. It has its own norms and rules that are kind of unique to it. His examples include the following. He says, it also outside business isn't true. He says, within business, people will often accept conscious misstatement and concealment of pertinent facts in negotiations, and lying on resumes, and utility companies' manipulation of regulators. Carr makes, as I said, an analogy with poker. Poker obviously is a game. Poker, like most if not all card games, involves concealment, and particularly concealment of one's hand. And poker, in addition, involves kind of deception, that is to say, pretending to have a different hand from that which one has. Okay, and all these things are acceptable within poker, although there is illegitimate cheating in poker, by the way, of course. Now, as our author says, any activity can affect human welfare is subject to moral assessment. So Shaw wants us to be very skeptical of anyone who says there's some human practice that is immunized from ordinary moral norms. Carr's analogy itself is weak, his poker analogy. People affected by business don't typically consent to the deception, which can amount to fraud, which is properly illegal. Further, deception can make a business or an economy much less efficient by driving people away and by creating business activity in which there's not mutual benefit. In other words, it's not win-win. At the end of Shaw's discussion of Carr, he says the following: in sum, by divorcing business from morality, Carr misrepresents both. He incorrectly treats the standards and rules of everyday business activity as if they had nothing to do with the standards and rules of ordinary morality, and he treats morality as something that we give lip service to on Sundays, but that otherwise has no influence on our lives. Now, I think what happens is this in Carr. Carr identifies what he calls personal morality with the norm of self-sacrifice, often associated with traditional religion, including Christianity. And he doesn't seem to understand how business can straightforwardly connect with self-sacrifice. And I understand that. But the problem is he thinks that the only kind of morality that can connect to business has to be with that of self-sacrifice. And he understands to some degree the rule of self-interest in business. But he seems to think that business is like a competitive game where you have winners and losers. And that's a particularly, let's say, misleading and I think destructive way to look at business. But let me just try to explain why. It is true that in poker we have competition and we have people trying to defeat others. That's absolutely true. But if you think of the most successful businesses, whether it's Amazon, whether it's Walmart, or whether it's think of I don't know, Netflix, think of Whole Foods, think of Trader Joe's, think of Costco. Okay, does anyone really believe that they look at their customers as marks for deception, and that they want to take advantage of them, and the way that they're you really believe that they're successful because they're really good at getting what they want while frustrating the desires of their customers? Or in contrast, are those businesses extremely successful because they've delivered goods and services very efficiently in a competitive market, and they've done it very well, and they multiply transactions that are win-win? And I think the answer is that those businesses I mentioned have been very successful precisely because they're going out of their way to create value for their customers. Now, yeah, they're profiting from it. That's exactly right. And and many people would argue it's win-win. But they don't say, well, how many people can I defraud of their money today? How many people can? These businesses don't do that. Now, there are people who try to take advantage, like Bernie Madoff, who try to take advantage of the honesty that's more common than not. And there are people like that, no question, and they belong in prison, as Madoff was imprisoned. And that's exactly right. There are people who do that. But normally, that is not the recipe for a flourishing business. Now, I will say this. Yes, in a competitive society, we have competition and cooperation. We have businesses that are competitive with one another in the same area. That's absolutely true. No question. But that doesn't mean that anything goes. That doesn't mean they're entitled to defraud people. And ideally, in a competitive situation, businesses have to hone their ability to serve consumers. And ideally, this leads to all sorts of innovation from which we all profit. And you see this on so many different levels. When you have a flourishing economy, you have constant innovation. You see it in the way that things are delivered through Amazon, the way they created their own delivery system. You see it through, you see so much innovation, and you see it even when it comes to machines counting change, how they've gotten, this generation of machines, they're better than the earlier ones. They spit out fewer coins, they're more effective, they're faster, and so on. You see this in tires. Car tires are better now than they were 20 years ago, and they last longer. But anyway, so competition can be a very good thing, but it doesn't mean anything goes. Okay? And even when there's competition, I can assure you that businesses need to cooperate. Not only do they have to cooperate for mutual advantage with their customers, they have to cooperate with their suppliers. Remember, all of us are consumers, all of us, and that includes businesses. And so we have an interest in treating consumers well because all of us are consumers. Businesses have an interest in getting along with their suppliers. Suppliers have an interest in getting along with the people to whom they sell. But in any event, Shaw's analogy with poker is a weak one for the reasons discussed. And I want to discuss something else. What is it to accept a moral principle? Now, Shaw, author, says to accept a moral principle is not a purely intellectual act like accepting a scientific hypothesis. It involves being motivated to follow the principle and feeling remorse or guilt when one falls short of the principle. For example, if someone says he hates animal cruelty, but he's regularly teasing and beating up his cat, we have good reason to think that the person really doesn't hate animal cruelty and is a hypocrite. So we have to look at to people's actions to determine whether they are accepting some moral principle. Because again, moral principles are typically action guiding, and we determine whether people are accepting them according to their actions and whether they try to comport their behavior with the acceptance of the principle. I want to talk about the conscience. The conscience is valuable, but it's not perfect. There are limits to conscience. Although following one's conscience is important, a conscience will not be infallible. At first, when we are ambivalent about the morality of some possible action, following our consciences can't lead us to a clear course. Second, one's conscience may be a product of prejudice, or at least the uncritical acceptance of what one has been taught. For example, people learn prejudices often from their parents, whom they usually respect. In the United States, for example, people used to be taught that black and white people shouldn't eat together, much less date and marry. That's what they were taught, and many people uncritically accepted that. So if they conscientiously followed what they were taught, that may not always be a good thing. So the conscience, again, though valuable, is imperfect. I now want to talk about a topic, moral principles and self-interest. Although morality and self-interest are often compatible, most philosophers believe there are occasions on which they could conflict. To see, though, how morality and long-term self-interest will often be compatible, consider how you teach your children values if you wanted them to be happy. Would you teach your children to take responsibility for their lives, to learn marketable skills, to create value for themselves and others, and to get along with others? Would you do that if you wanted them to be happy? Or would you teach your children to constantly try to get something for nothing and to take advantage of others? If you wanted your children to be happy, would you want your children to contribute to society and to others and to develop their skills? And would you want them to form productive and mutually beneficial relationships with others? Shaw does think that normally moral behavior will be compatible with business profit, and that respecting the rights of workers, treating suppliers fairly, and being straightforward with customers makes good business sense. Yet Shaw asserts that we can't always guarantee that doing the right thing will always pay off in purely self-interested terms. Sometimes, for example, the right thing to do might mean turning in your best friend to the police. Now, further, Shaw asserts that a truly moral person will inherently value doing the right thing and treating others well. Okay, I want to talk a little bit about moral reasoning. Moral reasoning or argument typically will move from a moral standard through one or more factual statements about some person, action, or policy related to that standard to a moral judgment about that person, action, or policy. Suppose someone says the following. This is a very simple form of argument. The book talks about this. If an action violates the law, it's morally wrong. Okay? If an action violates the law, it's morally wrong. Okay? Whoops. There you go. Affirmative action on behalf of women and minorities violates the law, alleged fact. Therefore, affirmative action is morally wrong. Now, that's a basic moral argument. Now, that argument now I'm not saying that we should accept the argument, but I'm just trying to illustrate what a basic argument would look like, moral argument. It embodies a simple argumentative structure. Premise 1 is a standard of wrongness. Premise 2 is a statement that pretty much that some practice fits a standard. It's an alleged fact. And then there's a conclusion, which is a particular moral judgment. Now, let's talk about good moral reasoning. It'll often involve several standards and factual claims. If a moral judgment or conclusion is defensible, then it must be supported by a defensible moral standard together with the relevant facts. Now, people can criticize moral arguments by attacking the moral standards involved or the factual assertions made in the premises, or both. Okay? Now, that particular argument we showed, really, the conclusion necessarily follows on the premises, so it's a valid deductive argument, but that doesn't mean we should accept the conclusion, because there could be one or both premises that could be attacked. Now, it's fairly easy to criticize the moral standard asserting that all illegal activity is morally wrong. After all, it was illegal to help slaves escape in America, and it was illegal to help persecuted members of minorities in Nazi Germany. How could someone change the standard equating illegality with immorality? Well, how about this modified standard? If a practice violates a law that isn't inherently unjust and that reflects the majority's will, it's wrong. Let me read that again. If a practice violates a law that isn't inherently unjust and that reflects the majority's will, it's wrong. Although the revised standard may not be perfect, it's much stronger than the original one. In the affirmative action argument, the participants could debate whether affirmative action in any way violates a law that isn't inherently unjust and reflects the popular will. I'm not interested here in discussing the merits of affirmative action. I just am trying to show how moral arguments, at least by respectful, rational participants, can involve give and take and progressive refinements of positions. I want to talk about requirements for moral judgments. Moral judgment should be logical. The judgment should follow from the relevant standard or standards in a statement about conduct or policy. If someone claims that it's morally wrong to break a promise just because it's inconvenient to keep, it's expected that the person should similarly judge a promise broken by his or her friend, or by him or her. Moral judgment should be based on facts. If someone disapproves of some practice, whether it's insider trading or masturbation, he or she should base that disapproval on all relevant facts, which presumably would include the effects of the practices. Now, it's been said that when dealing with our judgments, we should go with considered moral beliefs. What are considered moral beliefs? Considered moral beliefs will contrast with, let's say, our gut responses, with beliefs based on ignorance or prejudice, and with beliefs we just happen to hold without having thought them through. Considered moral beliefs are those beliefs we'll hold after we have made a conscientious effort to think about our beliefs coolly, rationally, impartially, with conceptual clarity, and with as much relevant information as we can reasonably acquire. Conformity with considered moral beliefs gives us at least some reason for at least provisionally accepting our beliefs. Okay? So when it comes to thinking about right and wrong, we need to think about everyone affected by our actions. We need to be able to look at things from the multiple points of view when it comes to the interests of people. We need to be concerned with again, the effects of our actions on people. We need to be concerned to treat people with dignity and respect. There's certain basic things we should concern. We should try in general to follow the golden rule. And we should be concerned with certain ideals of equality under the law, ideals of respecting others, and treating others with dignity. The golden rule. I mean, you could say there's certain morally relevant standards and practices that can make it more likely that we'll come up with good moral decisions. Okay, morality is a very complex thing. Ethics, the study of morality, is very complex. But in any event, I've more or less concluded the first lecture. And in this first lecture, I've pretty much gone over some of the expectations, in fact, the major expectations of the course. I've gone over the first chapter of our book. And I want to re-emphasize something, and that is this. I want you to feel free to pause any lecture that I give after 20 or 25 minutes, even if you pause it just for a few minutes. Walk around, get something to eat or drink. I probably should be sipping water all along, and then go back to it. Now, you'll find out that that'll be a very good thing. Now, why is that? First of all, you'll have more energy. Second, you'll be more likely to remember and understand what you're listening to, because people remember most of what they hear first and what they hear last. If you have lots of breaks, even though they're short, you'll have more learning, because you'll have more of the first and last things you learn. Okay, so you'll remember more. You'll have more energy. You'll be able to concentrate better. So I do encourage you students to take frequent breaks from your reading and from your studying these lectures. And that means every 20-25 minutes taking a break of a few minutes. I think that's a quite legitimate thing to do. I think what you want to do is regularly study stuff, regularly go over it, and I encourage you to try to paraphrase some of the key ideas I talk about, so that you could even give a mini lecture yourself based on them. And you can do that with friends or roommates, relatives, or even if you give a lecture to your stuffed animals, you'll find out that by actively paraphrasing the material, that you will most likely learn it better. Okay, so I do encourage you to do all of those things. I also encourage you to keep in touch with me. So if you have any questions at all, I want you to email me, and also, when you email me, I'll let you know that I received it. If you say something and all I need to do is say thank you, I'll say thank you, but that'll show also that I saw what you sent. Okay. If you don't see some response from me of some kind within 12 to 24 hours, please contact me again, because typically I respond right away to emails, and I check my email at least once, and often more than once every day. So you definitely want to get back in touch with me if you don't hear from me within 12 to 24 hours after you send an email. And I suppose that is it for this first introductory lecture to Philosophy 303 and at Old Dominion University. Thank you.